I never imagined a Tuesday morning could split my life into before and after. At 64, I believed I had weathered every storm fate might conjure: bereavement, illness, financial strain. Even the slow loneliness that follows when a house once filled with voices grows quiet. Harold's death 3 months ago had felt like the last cruel blow. I was surviving, one careful day at a time, clinging to small rituals that tethered me to him. So when the attorney's office called, their voice flat and businesslike, "Mrs. Whitmore, we're ready to proceed with the estate settlement. 2 o'clock today." I didn't hesitate. My fingers trembled as I hung up the phone. After months of waiting, I was ready to close this chapter, to honor Harold's careful planning. Everything was supposed to be simple. The estate to me, with provision for Michael, our only son, after I was gone. At least, that was the world Harold and I had built together. That morning I dressed with a deliberateness that felt almost sacred. I pulled out the navy blue dress Harold had insisted flattered my eyes. It had been his anniversary gift only 2 years before, on the day we toasted 35 years of marriage. Around my neck, I clasped the pearl necklace he'd given me on our wedding day, a necklace that had borne witness to decades of dinners, arguments, reconciliations, and holidays. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, the woman staring back wasn't the Mildred I remembered. Grief had carved deep parentheses around my eyes, and my auburn hair shimmered more silver than I wanted to admit. The drive downtown stretched longer than usual, the freeway congested with restless commuters. I drummed my fingers against the steering wheel, a nervous tic I thought I had outgrown. But it wasn't traffic alone that unsettled me. Something in my chest twisted with unease, as if Harold himself were whispering caution. I pulled into the shadowed garage beneath the law office building, the air stale with oil fumes and dust. The place smelled of metal and mildew, every footstep echoing in cavernous hollows. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, gathering my documents, reminding myself this was routine, just paperwork. Then a voice cut through the gloom. "Ma'am, don't start that car." I jolted, my hand freezing on the door handle. A man emerged from behind a concrete pillar, his figure half swallowed by shadow. He looked disheveled, 50s perhaps, clothes frayed at the seams, boots scuffed nearly white. His hair was unkempt, face weathered like leather left too long in the sun. At first glance, he looked like any homeless man lingering where he shouldn't. My instinct was to hurry, maybe even run. Harold had always warned me about garages, about dark corners, and strange men. But then I saw his eyes. They weren't wild, they weren't threatening. They were urgent, almost desperate, yet strangely steady. "Please," he said, keeping distance. "You're Mrs. Whitmore, right? Harold's widow?" My chest seized. How does this man know my name? Harold's name? "I don't know who you are," I managed, voice shaking as I fumbled for my phone. He lifted his hands slowly, palms outward. "My name's Eddie Kowalski. I used to work upstairs at Morrison & Associates, 12 years as a paralegal before they fired me last month. I've been waiting here because I need to warn you about your daughter-in-law." The words landed like a slap. Maisie. Sweet-faced, careful-voiced Maisie, my son's wife of 8 years, the girl who'd sat at my dinner table and called me Mom. What about her? "She's been meeting with the firm, with Morrison himself. She's preparing documents, false ones, claims that you're not competent to handle the estate. Medical records, statements from people saying you're confused, forgetful. They're planning to pressure you into signing papers today, to put the estate under her control." My breath left me in a rush. The world tilted. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I've never been diagnosed with anything. I handle my own life perfectly well." "I know, ma'am. That's why I'm here. She told Morrison you probably wouldn't even remember today's meeting. She was counting on you not showing up." I leaned against the car for balance, the concrete cold against my palm. My heart hammered not just with fear, but with rage. How dare she? How dare anyone reduce me to a caricature of senility? Eddie's voice softened. "There's more. They're forging amendments to your husband's will. Papers saying he wanted to change it in his last weeks, that he worried about your ability to manage finances. I made copies before they fired me. Harold's real will is intact, but they're hoping you'll never see it." The parking garage seemed to close in on me, the pillars bending like bars. I studied Eddie's face, searching for deceit, But what I found instead was something rarer: conscience. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling me this. "Why risk this for me?" I asked. "Because Harold was kind to me," he said simply, "and because what they're doing isn't right." The elevator dinged somewhere above us, startling me. Eddie stepped back into the shadows. "Be careful in there. Don't sign anything without reading. They'll try to rush you." And then he was gone, melted back between the concrete columns. I stood rooted, the echo of his warning thrumming through me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as madness. But another part, the part that had seen Maisie's subtle glances, her quiet whispers to Michael, her faint irritation when I spoke of Harold, knew Eddie was telling the truth. With trembling hands, I pressed the elevator button. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of Eddie's worried face watching me from the shadows. The ride upward stretched like eternity. 15 floors of silence and anticipation, carrying me toward a table where predators in suits waited with their polished lies, and where my daughter-in-law sat smiling like a dutiful lamb. But I was not the lamb they thought I was. The elevator chimed open on the 15th floor, spilling me into an office designed to impress or intimidate. The reception area glowed with polished mahogany desks, soft leather chairs, and oil paintings of old Boston landscapes. To a casual visitor, it would whisper success, stability, heritage. But to me, after Eddie's warning, it looked like a stage set built to disguise rot beneath its velvet curtains. "Mrs. Whitmore," the receptionist said, smile as polished as the marble beneath my feet. "They're waiting for you in conference room A." The hallway stretched ahead, unnaturally quiet. Most doors were closed, the muffled murmur of voices leaked only faintly. My heels clicked on the marble like a metronome marking time before an execution. Through the frosted glass of conference room A, I saw shapes, suited men, a petite woman with hair I would have known anywhere, Maisie. When I opened the door, the trap revealed itself in full. 3 men sat in immaculate suits, cufflinks gleaming, ties knotted with surgical precision. They radiated the confidence of men used to dictating reality by rearranging paperwork. And across from them sat Maisie. She looked up at me, surprise flickering in her eyes like a candle before she smothered it beneath that sweet smile she had worn for 8 years. "Oh, Mildred," she said warmly, "I didn't think you'd come today." I felt the words strike like a dart. Eddie had been right. She hadn't expected me. "Of course I'm here," I replied evenly. "This is about my husband's estate." One of the lawyers, a thin man with silver hair and eyes like ice chips, gestured toward the empty chair opposite. "Mrs. Whitmore, please. We have documents for your signature." I set my purse firmly on the table before sitting. From the corner of my eye, I saw Maisie twisting her wedding ring around her finger, avoiding my gaze. Papers slid across the polished surface toward me. My breath caught as I opened the folder. Inside were reports, statements, even photographs, pages heavy with implication. Mildred became confused while shopping. Mildred accused her son of stealing. Mildred showed signs of financial mismanagement. In Maisie's careful handwriting, accusations had been inked like poison into the record. "This is false," I said, my voice shaking not from weakness but fury. "Every word of this is false." Maisie's voice was soft, pitying. "Mildred, you don't remember? You accused Michael of—" "Enough." The word cut the air sharper than I intended. I would not let them weave a story around me while I sat breathing in the room. As I spoke, my eyes caught a blink of red light from the corner. A recording device, hidden, but not well enough. "Are you recording me?" I demanded. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. "It's standard practice," one said quickly. "Standard practice," I repeated, "to record a grieving widow without consent?" The room froze. For a moment, the weight of silence pressed against the mahogany walls, then 3 raps at the door. The secretary leaned in. "Mr. Morrison, there's a man here. He says it's urgent. His name is Eddie Kowalski." Every drop of color drained from Maisie's face. "I don't know anyone by that name," Morrison snapped. "Send him away." But I was already standing. "Number, let him in." The door opened, and Eddie stepped through cleaner than in the garage, but still out of place among mahogany and suits. His worn messenger bag sagged at his side. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "I'm sorry to intrude, but you need to see this." Morrison bolted upright. "You're trespassing. Security?" "Call them," Eddie replied calmly. "But first let her see the truth." He pulled a manila folder from his bag, laying it on the table like a dealer revealing his hand. Inside were copies. Harold's original will, dated months before his illness worsened. Medical reports from his longtime doctor, unstained by fabrication. Receipts for payments funneled to witnesses. For a long moment, no one breathed. I heard only the furious rhythm of my own heart. Maisie swayed in her chair, pale as porcelain. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Finally, she sank back, her body trembling, mascara threatening to streak. Eddie's voice was steady, righteous. "These men helped your daughter-in-law attempt to rewrite history. They forged your husband's signature, invented concerns that never existed. And they planned to rob you of not just your estate, but of your dignity." I looked at the documents, at Harold's familiar signature looping strong and clear across the page. The same hand I had seen jot grocery lists and birthday cards. Real, true, unaltered. Tears blurred my vision, not of grief but of something fiercer vindication. The lawyers shuffled papers, stammered, trying to retreat behind procedure. But the facade of power was cracking, the beautiful trap collapsing under the weight of Eddie's truth. And Maisie, my sweet-faced, careful-voiced daughter-in-law, looked suddenly like a stranger wearing her own mask, caught in the blinding light of exposure. The room had barely absorbed the shock of Eddie's revelations when another knock rattled the door. This time, it wasn't a secretary but a woman in a dark blazer, her badge clipped to her hip. She entered with the quiet authority of someone used to navigating rooms where power pretends to be law. "Detective Sarah Chen," she introduced herself, her voice firm but not unkind. "I received a call about irregularities regarding Mr. Whitmore's estate." The attorneys shifted, like boys caught with matches near gasoline. Maisie sat frozen, her eyes darting between me, Eddie, and the detective. Detective Chen placed a small notebook on the table and began leafing through Eddie's folder. Her eyes scanned the documents with practiced precision. Every forged letter, every falsified report, every receipt for consulting fees, masquerading as bribes, she absorbed them all without visible reaction, only the faint tightening of her jaw. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said at last, turning to me, "I'm going to need to hear, in your own words, about your relationship with your daughter-in-law, from the beginning." I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. And then I began. 8 years unspooled like a film reel. The first dinner when Michael had brought Maisie home, her laughter bright but always a little rehearsed. The way she had echoed Harold's jokes with just enough enthusiasm to charm him. The careful attentiveness that at the time I mistook for kindness, but now, in retrospect, felt more like study. "She was perfect," I said bitterly. "Too perfect, always agreeable. Always telling us exactly what we wanted to hear. I thought it was love. Now I wonder if it was calculation." The memories rearranged themselves, puzzle pieces suddenly snapping into darker shapes. I spoke of the subtle comments Maisie mentioning I seemed forgetful, or asking if I recalled conversations that had never happened. At the time, I dismissed them as harmless observations. Now I saw them for what they were, seeds planted in the soil of doubt. Maisie's lips trembled, tears welling. "I was concerned," she whispered. "That's all. Concerned." "No," I said, voice firm. "You were planting a story where I was the confused widow, and you were the savior ready to manage my life." Detective Chen turned to Eddie. "And you witnessed her involvement with the firm?" Eddie nodded, pulling a tattered notebook from his bag. "About 6 months ago, she started coming in regularly. Morrison said it was routine estate planning, but the meetings became secretive. I kept notes, dates, times, even snippets I overheard." He flipped through pages, his handwriting cramped but meticulous. "She brought in medical reports, but I checked the letterheads. They didn't match the hospital's format. She submitted statements from supposed family friends, same phrasing repeated across different signatures. And these photos," he held one up. The image showed me at a grocery checkout, smiling as the cashier bagged my items, but beneath it, a caption in Maisie's handwriting. Mildred appeared confused about payment, needed help from bystanders. I gripped the table, fury radiating through me. "You were following me, photographing me like I was a criminal." Maisie flinched, her voice cracked. "The lawyers said, We needed documentation. Documentation of what? That I buy groceries? That I speak to a cashier? My words cut sharper than any blade. Detective Chen's pen scratched across her notebook. She didn't interrupt, letting the silence press down until Maisie broke. We had debts. Maisie burst out suddenly, tears streaking mascara down her cheeks. $300,000, 2 mortgages, Michael's business failing, credit cards maxed out. We were drowning. The number echoed in the air, obscene. My stomach turned. $300,000. Harold would have helped in a heartbeat if they had only asked. And so you decided to steal from me, I said coldly. Maisie shook her head violently. Not steal. Redirect. The trust would have taken care of you. $40,000 a year for living expenses, everything else to cover the debts. Eddie snorted. An allowance. She would have lived like a child begging for pocket money while you erased her husband's legacy. The truth hung heavy between us. Maisie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. The carefully constructed mask she had worn for 8 years crumbled into raw, desperate honesty. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman I had called daughter, who had sat at my holiday table, who had stood by Harold's hospital bed, was no longer recognizable. Detective Chen closed her notebook, her eyes sharp and steady. Mrs. Whitmore, this is serious evidence of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. I'll need full statements from you and Mr. Kowalski. As for Mrs. Whitmore's daughter-in-law, she paused, her gaze slicing toward Maisie. There will be consequences. Maisie whimpered, curling inward, the reality finally crushing her pretense. But I felt no pity. Only the steel of betrayal cooling into resolve. 3 days later, I opened my front door to find my son standing on the porch. Michael looked as though the last 8 years had aged him in a single week. His shirt was wrinkled, hair mussed, eyes ringed with dark shadows. Beside him, Maisie looked smaller than I had ever seen her, fragile as if one more gust of truth might shatter her completely. Mom, Michael's voice cracked on the word. We need to talk. I stepped aside, though not warmly. Come in. They sat together on the old beige couch Harold and I had chosen years ago, the same one where Michael had first introduced Maisie as his fiancée, the same couch where we had shared birthdays, Thanksgivings, Christmas mornings. Now, it felt tainted. Every cushion soaked with memories turned bitter. I remained standing, arms crossed, anchoring myself in resolve. Detective Chen told me everything, Michael began, about the false reports, the forged documents, the will. Mom, I swear to you I didn't know. I studied his face, searching for sincerity. The boy I had raised, the man I had trusted. But you knew about the debts. His shoulders slumped. Yes, we're drowning. The business is failing. We owe money everywhere. And I was too ashamed to tell you. Too ashamed to tell Dad before he died. I thought I could fix it. Then, when he got sick, I started thinking about the inheritance. It stung, the word like a blade twisted. Inheritance, Harold's years of work, turned into their lifeline. Maisie finally spoke, her voice hoarse. I twisted things, normal moments. I told Michael you'd forgotten dinner plans last Christmas, that you seemed lost driving, that you accused the mailman of stealing, that you hid money. I gripped the arm of a chair, my nails digging into the wood. None of that happened. Michael canceled Christmas dinner because you were sick. I knew the neighbor's dog's name perfectly well. And yes, I once put milk in the pantry after 3 hours of gardening, but that doesn't make me senile. Michael's face crumpled, confusion turning to horror as he looked at her. Maisie, you told me. She wept openly now, hands clutching his sleeve. I lied. I made you see problems that weren't there. I wanted you to believe your father had doubts, that he thought your mother needed help. Michael recoiled as if struck. The ground he had trusted collapsed beneath him. I straightened, steady and cold. You didn't just try to steal from me. You poisoned my son against me. You made him doubt his own mother. Silence thundered through the room. The clock on the wall ticked, each second heavy as judgment. Finally, I reached into my purse and drew out the copy of the trust Eddie had unearthed. I slid it across the coffee table toward Michael. He read the figures, his lips moving silently. His eyes widened. $40,000 a year, I said flatly. That was what they thought I was worth. while the rest of your father's estate went to pay your debts. Michael looked up, his face ashen. It would have wiped out everything in 5 years. I nodded. 45 years of Harold's work, erased, so you could start over while I lived on scraps. Maisie's sobs filled the space, jagged and pitiful. We weren't trying to hurt you, she pleaded. You just wanted to control me. I cut in, my voice sharp. To strip me of my independence, to make me beg for my own money. That isn't care, that is theft dressed in pity. Michael covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. For the first time, I saw not just my son, but a man who realized the life he'd been living was built on lies. What happens now, Mom? His voice broke as he lowered his hands. What do you want us to do? The question hung heavy in the air. I thought of Harold's faith, of Eddie's courage, of the betrayal that had hollowed my home. Justice, revenge, forgiveness, none of those words fit neatly. I stepped closer, my voice low but unwavering. What happens now depends on what you're willing to do to make this right. Both of you. The silence that followed was the truest trial of all. The weeks that followed felt like moving through a different season of life, one where truth had stripped every tree bare. The justice system turned its wheels slowly, but inexorably. Maisie, faced with Eddie's meticulous evidence and Detective Chen's persistence, accepted a plea agreement. 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution of every dollar she and Michael had funneled to Morrison's firm. The lawyers weren't as fortunate. Morrison himself was sentenced to 4 years in prison, his associates 2 apiece. Their mahogany desks and oil paintings had become evidence in a courtroom, reminders of how greed can wear the mask of respectability. I watched their sentencing from a hard wooden bench, my pearl necklace cool against my throat, and felt no triumph, only relief that Harold's legacy had not been reduced to footnotes in a scam. Michael's road was harder. He moved out of the house he shared with Maisie, selling it at a loss. Their vacations, once plastered across social media, all turquoise beaches and champagne glasses, had been bought with credit cards, and now those bills arrived like vultures. He rented a modest downtown apartment, traded his sleek BMW for a 10-year-old Honda, and spent 16-hour days clawing his consulting business back from the ashes. "Mom, I can't take your money," he told me one evening over coffee, when I offered to help with his debts. His face was gaunt, but his voice steadier than I'd heard in months. "I need to do this right this time, on my own." It pained me to watch him struggle, but I saw in him a new resolve, a humility that hadn't existed before. He was learning what Harold had always known, that integrity mattered more than appearances, and resilience more than pride. Eddie, meanwhile, became an unexpected fixture in my life. I hired him part-time to tend the garden and grounds, giving him the small apartment above Harold's workshop. Watching him sweep leaves, repair fences, or carry trays of seedlings, I saw a man rebuilding himself, too. The same hands that had once sorted legal documents now coaxed tomatoes and roses from the soil. "Funny, isn't it?" he said one morning, pressing a steaming mug of coffee into my hands. "I spent years helping rich men twist the law. Now I spend my days making sure your roses don't wilt." "Eddie," I told him, smiling, "you're doing more good now than you ever did in that office." There was irony, too, in Maisie's punishment. She was assigned to community service at the local food bank, serving meals to people who looked too much like Eddie had months earlier, when he was sleeping in his car and surviving on day-old bread. From time to time, Eddie saw her when he went to pick up supplies for the church pantry. "She works hard," he admitted one afternoon, stacking boxes on the porch. "Doesn't talk much, but maybe she's learning what desperation really looks like." I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me wanted her to suffer, to taste humiliation for every lie she'd planted in Michael's heart. But another part, the part Harold had always loved most in me, hoped she might change. Not for my sake, but for her own soul. And as for me, I had no intention of becoming a woman defined by what others tried to take from her. I began volunteering at the library, tutoring adults, learning to read. I met other widows at the senior center, sharing stories about the quiet frauds and helpful relatives who circled when wills and estates came into play. Detective Chen asked me to speak at a seminar for older citizens, warning them about financial exploitation. I told my story, not as a victim, but as someone who had walked through fire and come out with her dignity intact. At home, I found solace in the garden. Harold's workshop still smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. His tools lay where he had left them. Labels in his neat handwriting still stuck to jars of nails and screws. Sometimes I stood there with my hand resting on the worn workbench, feeling his presence like a steady pulse beneath my skin. The seasons turned, roses bloomed, tomatoes ripened, leaves reddened, and with each passing day, the bitterness inside me ebbed, replaced by something quieter, sturdier. Not forgiveness, not yet, but peace. 6 months later, the world outside my window looked softer, gentler. Autumn had painted the maple tree Harold and I planted for Michael's 10th birthday in shades of fire, scarlet, amber, gold. The seasons reminded me that even what seems permanent can be transformed, that endings make space for beginnings. Maisie's sentence was public record by then. Probation, restitution, community service at the food bank. I heard from Eddie that she worked quietly, head down, handing out trays of soup and bread to people who had less than nothing. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. She was serving those who had walked Eddie's path, who had known desperation without ever choosing betrayal. Perhaps she was learning, perhaps not. Either way, it was no longer my burden to carry. The lawyers sat in prison cells, their marble floors replaced by concrete, their silk ties traded for state-issued grays. Justice had been served, if only partially. But justice had never been the whole point. What mattered was reclaiming my own story, my own worth. Michael came every Sunday now, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just for coffee. He looked thinner, worn down by 12-hour days, but his eyes had regained something I feared I'd never see again: clarity. One afternoon he showed me a photo on his phone, a modest storefront with the name Whitmore Consulting painted proudly on the glass. "I signed the lease yesterday," he told me. "It's mine, built the right way this time." I squeezed his hand, tears pricking my eyes. "Your father would be proud, and so am I." He hesitated, then asked the question I knew was coming. "Mom, can you ever really forgive me?" Forgiveness is not a thunderclap. It is a dawn, slow, gradual, warming piece by piece. "I forgive you every morning I wake up," I told him. "Some days it's harder than others. But you were a victim too, Michael. She used your love for me against you. That doesn't erase the hurt, but it does explain it." He cried then, quietly, like he had as a boy when Harold taught him to ride a bike and he fell, skinning his knees. I held him, not as the wronged party, but as his mother, someone who would never stop wanting his redemption. As for Maisie, my answer was different. "I've let go of the anger," I admitted to Michael. "That doesn't mean I forgive, and it certainly doesn't mean I trust. She will never be welcome in my life again, but I refuse to let her steal any more of my peace." That evening, after he left, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Eddie joined me, setting down 2 steaming mugs, his presence steady as always. Beyond the garden, solar lights glowed softly, the same red pinpoints that once terrified me in that conference room, now reborn into beacons of calm. I thought of Harold then, of the life we had built together. His love was still here in the security he'd left me, in the values he'd instilled in our son, in the strength that rose in me when I was tested. His estate was never just money. It was faith, it was dignity, and no scheme, however cruel, could erase that. I looked up at the night sky, stars pricking holes in the darkness. For the first time in years, I felt something simple, something profound. Peace. Not the peace of having everything I wanted, but of knowing who I was and what I was worth. I was free. And now, I wonder about you who have listened all this way. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced betrayal dressed as love? Tell me your story in the comments. Because stories, when shared, are how we remind each other that truth has more power than lies. Thank you for walking with me through mine.